Along with some other people in the community, I've been watching the videos on UU history and enjoying the conversation with no small amount of amazement. I'm reminded how little I know about history of any sort, and history of this church in particular. I'm also realizing what encouraged me to wander towards UUism in the 50s, in my 50s. That what that was is what some people have believed since the moment people began talking about a religion based on Jesus. In 325 Common Era, people were racing to Nicaea. Someone once said ventre à terre, which is something I like to be able to drop into a sermon now and again. You don't get to use that very often. And it's actually in a fashion which would have made a great docudrama if you thought about what went on the road to Nicaea for people of these two different factions. Well, and actually there were several questions being decided, but everybody's saying, oh no, Nicaea's that way, and ride off in that direction. And so, but the critical vote was on whether Jesus was of God or made by God, begotten, not made, for those of you who grew up with the Nicene Creed, and whether Jesus was eternal or, in fact, had a beginning point, albeit before the creations of the world. Because I believed in a fledgling piece of my soul, because what I believed in a fledgling piece of my soul was so different from what I was taught in seminary, because seminary only really taught the winners' viewpoints, even though they purported to teach both Christians and Unitarians. I really didn't have the courage, imagination, or hunger to see it differently then. Perhaps I also wasn't willing to challenge the Christianity I knew, even though I was willing to leave it for goddess-based traditions. Leaving allowed me to let it lie fallow. We've all heard our dear Sarah talk about being 5th and 6th generation UU, and certainly some of the rest of you are cradle UUs. So how many of you are cradle UUs? One? Yeah, so some of the rest, one of the rest of us. So next time I'll be talking on retaining UU membership so that some of our cradle UUs actually, or our newly born cradle UUs remain. But if we ever needed an argument for why the world needs us, the fact that we've got a room full of people and one person and the rest of us who hurried up the best as fast as we could to get here, I'm thinking, that's it. But I didn't get both how ancient and how radical UUism it was from its inception. And really, at this point, we should talk about Unitarianism. But it's so much easier to say UUism. Right. So I've been fairly content all along to allow Sarah to be our UUist, and a great one she is. And she's wonderful at research and a pretty darn good example of being a good UU. And although it is true that the UU moments continue my reading a little bit of this and a little bit of that in history, and which isn't necessarily helpful for understanding the whole continuum of history. Mostly I've viewed myself, as I believe many of us do when we come here, as having evolved or immigrated to this tradition. I've always worried about the word convert. Most converts I know are so strident in their discovery of the truth that they allow for nothing other than their way. That's a fairly non-UU way right there. I also have a closed, and I admit it, waspish background that posits that the Hebrew Scriptures admonitions to pray in the closets, that those are good things. I've never been much of an evangelist. And when I am now, it's often about the community aspects of UUism or the worth and dignity of every human being. And they are important. But there's something about beginning to understand a mere 12 years after I signed the book, which is that I follow in the footsteps of men and women who sacrificed their lives for the right to believe in one God. And you notice, David Farrance, they talked about it, was really the borderline becoming non-Trinitarian, anti-Trinitarian, and actually having a name, which starts us forward on a new trajectory. If we're only against something, that's a different position in life. It deepens the imperative, I think, for us to make a real and welcoming home for seekers, believers, non-believers. I think it means we have to do more than say, hey, it's great to meet you, when people come. I believe we need to let people know, many people, that we're here, because the world remains dangerous to those who think differently, to those who choose. People need to know there is refuge here, a refuge into which they will be welcomed and then encouraged to keep searching. The search should always beget more questions. Early non-Trinitarian believers, as they were called, were put to the stake and burned or tucked into dungeons. Why burned? And I'm not sure we got this right, Lenore, whether it was the religious leaders or all leaders who were prohibited from shedding blood. So they burned people. It was just religious leaders? Right. So they burned them. Pleasant, huh? The grand and awful hymn we sang, which is wildly Protestant, was first fashioned to talk about making the choice to become followers of Jesus, known to them as the Christ. The second and third verses in that version read, "Then to side with truth is noble, when we share her wretched crust, ere her cause bring fame and profit, and 'tis prosperous to be just. Then it is the brave man chooses, while the coward stands aside, till the multitude make virtue of the faith they had denied. By the light of burning martyrs, Christ, thy bleeding feet we track, tolling up new Calvaries ever with the cross that turns not back. New occasions teach new duties, ancient values test our youth. They must upward still and onward, who would keep abreast of truth." It's a ghastly image. They sang that in churches for years. Yes, and still do, right. It's an image that I never associated with my liberal religion, that my forebears would be those who stood so strongly for what they believed that they would accept death by fire. And I confess I never believed that those I had up until that point, those people who I thought were my people would have been the ones doing the burning. I mean, to me, that's some of the most egregious stuff, is that the people who paid such a harsh price to move away from a religion they found corrupt continued the practices. I don't know whether I'm that courageous. When I heard that after the Crusades, the Vatican annexed land for themselves and for their returning soldiers by offering the pagan villagers an option to drink boiling oil or to learn the Lord's Prayer and the Nicene Creed, I don't know that I would have been able to stand for the Lady and her grove. I said that the other day I always figured that's where the popular song started. You know the one, "Jesus is just all right with me." But these men and women persevered. They were hounded out of their homes and their jobs. As we were reminded by Mary Priestley, who dropped in the other day if you weren't here, they couldn't earn money, couldn't go to the shops, they were shunned. We say Joseph Priestley was burned out of his house in a neutral tone. He was burned out of his house. They escaped with their lives and probably very little else. Many people were part of those burnings. Many people were also burned. If they had been in their house, they would have died horribly, and it would have been understood as just punishment for their heresy. When we sit here and don't know the danger that they encountered, when we don't know that our liberal possibilities were so dearly won, we wrong ourselves and our ancestors. We weren't the only marginalized heretics by a long shot. Certainly the Quakers, and there were other people that they called the refusants and some other things. But And there's good evidence that surprisingly, we helped some and were helped by others, because too often outsiders turn against one another. And in this case, that did not happen. Always. But not enough of us know that one bunch of folks favored the writings of Socinus, who was also from Transylvania. How about that bishops 3 times? I'm really like, he probably has some great clothes, right? You bishops. And don't they still have them? I think there's still a bishop in Eastern Europe of the UU Church, which is sort of interesting for us. And I encountered a Swede, he was a Brit, actually, who had moved to Sweden this summer, and he was stunned when he came to a church in Washington to find out that most modern-day UU churches, while there are some Christian churches, many of them are not Christian, and it was shocking to him, because in Britain, many still are. But the writings of Socinus and the others thought of Arius, who was the original Arian controversy way back at the Nicaeans. So they'd still been fighting over this for 1,200 years. No, 1,500 years. Count my toes to get up there. And sort of basically, Faustus Socinus said that Jesus is an exemplar of humanity. The monk Arius held that Jesus was created by God personally and therefore more than human. There were bitter rifts and fights within churches here in this country, focusing on the image of God and the right to believe as you would want to. Once again, it's easy to think about people who are outside the norm as heretics. Those guys. But it's darned odd to understand that you wear the mantle of heresy. We should wear that proudly, not because we're proud to be different, but because our faith is important enough to us that we won't compromise our beliefs. This faith has existed for millennia. The word, as we were told, the word heretic comes from a Greek verb that, among other things, means to be able to choose. I like booty, though, you know. What is the booty we get, you know? It comes with responsibility. It comes with association. Our forebears have been struggling with this since the beginning. We were part of the Reformation. We were part of the formation of this country. There is a proud lineage of which we are but the recent branches on an ancient tree. Sarah is part of a more ancient shoot. So are some of the rest of you. However, the others of us are newly grafted on. But once the graft takes hold, we become part of the tree. What you believe matters to you, to this group, to our children, to the world. To the places in the world where we decide that we will actually make a difference, where we will encourage people's worth and dignity, encourage the democratic process, encourage an open search for truth and meaning, encourage the caretaking of our interconnected world. As I've been watching these films, I've been hearing once again the comment by another pastor that our liturgies were basically just wannabe Protestant liturgies. Actually, there's nothing wannabe about them. They are ancient Protestant liturgies. These liturgies descended through all branches of the Reformation. There are so many more denominations than simply the mainstream ones. We were there. Our peeps were there. We shared in the departure from Rome. We saw things differently, but our style of worship is centuries old and legitimately ours. Part of me wants to call her up and say, "Hey, wait a minute." And I could do that if I weren't a bit embarrassed that I'm not a better steward or student of my faith. And you may wonder why I didn't get more of this in polity classes in seminary, but I was reading feminism and preaching, and nowhere near enough history. And no one was teaching much about heresy, other than here's the heresy, it was wrong, 3 points on the test, And I'm really good at memorizing short-term for tests and forgetting it afterwards. That's part of the deal about memorization, isn't it? That if you can get it right for the test. Wait a minute. Lost myself. Should never go off book. But you rarely heard how the heresies were right. And for all Union was considered a non-denominational seminary with quite a few UUs, what we got was fairly party-line Christianity. I guess it's about time I get educated, huh? But now, in the last 50 years or so, UUism has come a great distance from a church that struggled with other Christians about whether or not Jesus was from or of God. Now we search our hearts and minds and souls for those precious things in which we find truth. Christianity may be a piece of that truth, it may not. But we continue to do our search in one another's company. What we're doing is awkward when we're trying to figure out what we believe and then working to stay open not only to what you believe, but also to how that might reshape my beliefs. This is hard work, but it's important. And then we have to put it out there for two reasons. One, because we are deeds, not creeds, people, and believing in the worth and dignity of every human being means not letting people go hungry or untended. And two, because there are those who are searching for us. They may be searching because they need a refuge. They may be searching because they're that kind of people, heretics. And when I say heretic, I mean it in the best and proudest possible way. UUism is a great challenge. Apparently, as humans, we're moved by simple, single images. There was a fascinating article I read recently about why fundraising for Ebola was such a bust. And mostly they believe it's because they were talking about too many people. We can all respond to one broken person. We know that's what's in us. And when you have a complex message like UUism, it's difficult to find that one thing to help people grab a hold of. But it's why I'm trying to write stories about Marjorie's beautiful little pictures for Love Flows. Cute, fluffy, hungry children. Since many, though not all of us, have rejected the notion of one identifiable God, and in particular a human God, whether or not there's a God for us, means we're grappling with abstracts. It's a challenge, and it's a pretty dicey marketing opportunity. But we're offering people the chance to choose. And we invite them to make those choices and to act on them. A lot of what's wrong in our world right now is that people are not acting on what they believe, no matter what they say. And they don't have communities to help them act. You have to be carefully taught. You have to become empowered and practice acting for good. It takes a long while for it to come naturally. This being a heretic is really quite hard work. But who wouldn't want to be one? Because there's a lot of space to live life large if you choose to do so. So tell the truth. Wouldn't you want to be a heretic too? Blessed be.